this goes like this over her ears, and this becomes on the side of her ears. And this, now, I don't, I help men put this on, but I never help women put this on, so maybe your partner could help her put this on.
Because people usually
Unless they're really good at this, and unless they really know how to do this, because clear, or sometimes they want to tuck it in. I don't know.
Yeah, I might be.
I tend to stay away from trying to help females do that. This is 10. There's 9 that are in the scene, and we can leave it at all.
The one that's actually massaging.
Yes, and that's just as a backup for her. I know she doesn't want to hold it, but and we don't usually have a problem with this. Well, here's how you turn it on. It's a little clip, just like that. So it's off right now. And so um, let's see. Let's talk to her first and see what she wants to do. We need to put this microphone on. I usually don't impose myself on women when putting microphones on. Okay, well, I'm just saying because you gotta hook it. Okay, this is how you do it, and you bring it around the back, and you put those over your ears, and you'll see this is right here. It'll work, and then you need to pull your hair back over it because it will. Just take it all over the top, and then it.
But I need to put it under my hair underneath.
Right. And it goes over your ears. Yeah, it's probably in the back again.
I want to pull my hair up.
It's stuck in your ear. That right there, and you might want to move your earrings on the other side. That's fine, as far as I'm concerned. And then this goes on your belt or waist, and let's just turn it on. There it is. It's on. So you've got this, and you can go. No,
I don't mind leaving my watch sitting right
I have my phone, but it'll disappear. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if I get close, I may go. I don't think it's going to be bad. I think it's going to be custom.
I'm definitely about to
Yeah. Yeah. You don't really.
You might want to go a little bit further down. That's right.
Bend like this.
Get you.
But I'm not going to.
They probably are. Yeah, so they're probably scared as well. But it doesn't sound like your ears are
No,
fucked.
it doesn't.
He's going to turn it on at the right opportunity from his end. All right, so I am about to enter this.
All right.
Welcome. Here we go. Thanks for being here. My name is Josh Brokaw, and I want to say on behalf of the ACU Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, as well as the ACU Department of Biology, how thankful we are to the members of Highland Church of Christ for making this space available and for all the technical help that made this possible. This visit from Janet Kellogg Ray has been sponsored by a grant from the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, with funding by the John Templeton Foundation and the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust. This is through a grant titled Supporting Structures, Innovative Partnerships to Enhance Bench Science at CCU Member Institutions. So despite that title, I just want to say this grant is much more than just a research grant. The CCCU rightfully recognizes the centrality of faith in the lives of the professors and students that they're serving, and they've provided a support for religious as well as scientific training as part of this grant funding. And furthermore, this same grant asks us to share those opportunities with the community, and that's what we're more than happy to do here tonight. For our first invited speaker, we're bringing Janet in to kick off what we hope is an annual event talking about science and faith with our students in the community. So with that, I want to say we're proud to introduce Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray, a 1982 alumna of the ACU Biology Department and author of the book Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark, The Bible and Modern Science and the Trouble of Making It All Fit. Everyone, Dr. Ray.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brokaw, and to the ACU Undergraduate Research, Creativity, and Innovation for inviting me to be a part of this event. I am so excited to be invited back by the department that prepared me so well for my career. And I have to say, it's wonderful to be back here in Highland. I was a part of this church for 4 years while I was a student at ACU, and I did Children's Bible Hour with the craziest bunch of college-age puppeteers you would ever meet, and I married one of them. And so those children, if they learned a Bible story, it would be a miracle, because those puppet shows were something else. I was raised in the conservative wing of the Restoration movement. And my grandfather was a gospel preacher, and my family went to church 3 times a week, and then every night of the week, if it was gospel meeting time, we would go school nights and all. And looking back on it, probably the most scarring thing about that childhood was that I never saw The Wizard of Oz until I was an adult. I actually saw it in the Cullen Auditorium when ACU would have free or cheap movies for students, because back in the day before on-demand streaming, The Wizard of Oz broadcast once a year and always on Sunday night. Yes, exactly, on Sunday night. But church was central to my family, and I treasure that upbringing. The Bible says that everything was created by God separately and specially in 6 days of the creation week. In my church and in my family of growing up, we would have no more questioned the historical, literal nature of the creation story than we would have questioned the existence of Jesus. It honestly just was never a conversation. Evolution was equated with atheism, and so that wasn't anything that we would ever consider. But in middle school, I fell in love with science, and I took that love to high school biology and then to college, and I had to rethink my approach to both science and faith. On the screen, you see up here a graphic of what was at one point in time the best explanation for the structure of the universe. This model was the ancient Greek model by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy. And as you can tell from the graphic, Ptolemy put the earth in the center of it all. The earth was the center of the universe. And then surrounding the earth were the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars, all in their own little shell, all nested together, kind of like those nesting Russian dolls. But when Rome fell, the works and writings of Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic model of the universe were lost to the Western world until the Middle Ages, when Greek astronomy and classic Greek text were rediscovered. The relatively new European universities were delighted because here for the first time was a real academic work in a science, in astronomy. And the science people at the universities were wanting a real academic work to rival the works of theology and medicine. And Ptolemy's work was that for them, a real actual academic work. But not everyone was excited about the rediscovery of this academic work. Some in the church objected. Genesis says there is a firmament. Where's the shell for the firmament? Genesis says that there are waters above the firmament. Where's the shell for the waters above the firmament? And where is the distinction that Genesis says it lies between the stars and the heavens? So now you have to understand that although the Ptolemaic model is obviously outdated and obsolete, at the time, the Ptolemaic model of the universe used the best observations, the best math, the best science of its day. But it didn't fit Genesis. So for the church in the Middle Ages, the solution was easy. The church in the Middle Ages just simply invented two new shells, added them to the model, and there you go. The science fits Genesis. Fast forward a few hundred years to the 18th and 19th century, where new fields of science, paleontology and geology, were really making waves. Geologists and paleontologists across Europe were making some remarkable discoveries. Apparently, different rock formations had their own unique assemblages of fossils. And this held true no matter where the rock formations were located. In fact, paleontologists and geologists of the 18th and 19th centuries were delighted to discover that they could predict what fossils would be found in a rock formation just by knowing the type of rock formation. While this knowledge delighted many geologists, it also scared a lot of them. Many of them were quite disturbed by this observation. For you see, there was an observable and predictable pattern to fossils and to rock layers. And it just looked for all the world like there had been an unfolding of life on Earth, an evolution, if you will, of life as testified to by the fossils. The man up here on the screen is French anatomist Georges Cuvier. Cuvier rose to fame early in the 19th century. So skilled an anatomist was Cuvier, it was said that he could reconstruct an entire animal with just a few fragments of bone. Cuvier was particularly puzzled by fossils of elephants found in, of all places, outside Paris. Now, these fossil elephants were distinctly different from any living elephants at the time, but they were still recognizable as elephants nonetheless. Well, many people, puzzled by this finding, proposed that actually these elephants were still living. We just haven't found them yet, and they're playing a really good game of hide and seek somewhere on the planet. But Cuvier wasn't buying it. As more and more massive fossils were discovered, Cuvier began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, things on Earth had been different in the past. Cuvier proposed that in the past, catastrophic events led to widespread destruction of species. In proposing this, Cuvier established for the first time the concept of extinction. As groundbreaking as the concept of extinction was, the response to his idea wasn't all positive. It was like, oh, Cuvier, slow it down. Extinction's no way. Because everyone knows that God created each creature specially, according to a divine plan, according to a divine design. So how can it be that massive numbers of creatures have perished? How can it be that creatures in the past are so different from creatures alive today? Surely these animals must be alive somewhere, and we just haven't found them yet. There we go. Despite the angst over the idea of extinction, Cuvier's landmark discoveries about extinction would prove to be essential to Charles Darwin's work in just a few decades from that point. Now, you have to understand that Darwin was not the first or even the only person of his time to suggest that life on Earth had changed, that life had evolved. Contemporaries of Cuvier suggested the same. But Cuvier was no evolutionist. In fact, Cuvier adamantly opposed evolution. And this anti-evolution position backed Cuvier into a corner. What is an anti-evolutionist to do with the obvious evidence of extinction? Cuvier decided that there must have been a dark and dangerous time that the Bible just doesn't tell us about, before Eden and before Noah's flood. Cuvier said this mysterious time in history was the source of the many fossils and the rock layers filled with fossils. In Cuvier's scenario, God created and then destroyed a pre-Genesis world that preceded the biblical 7-day creation. And just like that, we make the science fit Genesis. Well, following Cuvier's lead, other geologists and paleontologists expanded the idea of pre-Eden creations. More discoveries, more fossils, more unexplained evidence, and it became harder and harder to reconcile with the Bible. But again, the answer was easy. The answer was more creations. Eventually, European geologists crammed 27 separate creations and floods into the biblical story. And just like that, science fits the Bible. But, they're going to move, there we go. That wasn't the last time modern science was forced into the Bible. Dinosaurs, for example, are a big problem. You see, they're a big problem because in the fossil record, 65 million years pass between the death of the last dinosaur and the first appearance of modern humans, and that's a big problem. If Genesis is a literal historical account of life on Earth, then dinosaurs were created on the same day as humans. One way we have dealt with this problem is we just redefine our terms in order to make dinosaurs and humans coexist. And so biblical references to things like a behemoth and a leviathan were said to be just words that people used to describe dinosaurs before the word dinosaur was invented. Well, I'm getting sluggish here. There we go. But then we come to Genesis chapter 6. And dinosaurs are an even bigger problem for Noah and his ark. So on the screen up here is a fossil of Alamosaurus, a sauropod, and the sauropod dinosaurs, if you have dino-literate kids, will know that the sauropods were the largest animals to ever walk the planet. Well, Alamosaurus is a good old Texas guy. This is a fossil that takes up almost an entire gallery in the Perot Museum in Dallas. So here's our problem. How do we put 2 of these guys, and maybe even 14 of them, of the largest animals to walk the planet on the ark, and then multiply that by the number of different kinds of dinosaurs that we had, as well as the rest of the world's animals? And, how do we solve a problem like the dinosaurs? Well, we solve the problem with baby dinosaurs. In order to maintain a literal historical reading of Genesis, conventional wisdom says that Noah packed the ark with baby dinosaurs. The popular ark encounter in Kentucky states this as fact in their signage and in their displays with baby and juvenile dinosaurs caged throughout the ark. Baby dinosaurs on the ark became a metaphor for me. Baby dinosaurs became a metaphor for all the ways we try to force fit a literal reading of Genesis and modern science together. There is no more field of science more retrofitted to agree with a literal Genesis than the science of biological evolution, and a closely related second would be the age of the earth and the universe. Oh, went too fast. So these photographs were taken on a sunny September day on the campus of the University of Texas. And I think maybe in the spirit of Austin's motto of keep Austin weird, it's the only thing I can figure out, is this photograph of 2 famous Texans, Big Tex and a T-Rex. We had T-Rexes here. Big Tex and T-Rex were leading a march across the University of Texas campus, and they were leading a group of people holding placards which said, "Stand up for science." So what was happening on the campus at that time was the Texas State School Board was debating the adoption of a high school biology text. And there were several members of the state board that were blocking the adoption of that text because it taught the theory of evolution. Well, fortunately, in this case, science won the day, and the book was adopted. In the United States, polling tells us that 40%, almost 40%, of white evangelicals reject evolution. In Texas, people who self-identify as highly religious, not just evangelicals, the percentage approaches 50% of people who reject evolution. Unfortunately, what most people who reject evolution know about evolution comes from anti-evolution sources. And when anti-evolution sources are the primary sources of information, misconceptions inevitably occur. Probably one of the most prevalent, persistent misconceptions is that evolution equals atheism, like evolution is the opposite of faith. Research tells us that even non-religious people believe this way, that evolution requires atheism. That spans both religious and non-religious people. So often people of faith will not explore evolution in earnest because it is seen as anti-God. And a person of faith does not want to be seen or feel like they are opposing God. The reality is this: the theory of evolution, as used by biologists, says absolutely nothing at all about God or faith or religion or any other worldview for that matter. Here's another common misconception. Why do we have to study evolution? Evolution is just a theory. Like it's just somebody's wild idea or even educated guess. Like I might say to my friends, it's my theory that my Dallas Cowboys are going to win it all next year. That's not the way scientists use theories. That's just probably like a hopeful guess. Scientists use the term theory in a very different way. When an idea or a hypothesis continues to be supported for decades and hundreds of years, time and time and time again, across many experiments, across many researchers, many scientists, immense amounts of research, then a science idea reaches the rank, if you will, of a scientific theory. And you often hear, well, it's a theory, it's not a fact or a law. Well, if you're going to make a science hierarchy, theories rank above facts and laws because it's a science theory that makes sense of facts and laws. Science theories are the foundations of a body of science. Gravitation theory, germ theory, atomic theory, all of these are universally accepted. And I don't think anyone would say it's okay to jump out of an airplane without a parachute because gravitational theory is just a theory, right? Or let's say you have to have surgery and your surgeon rushes into the room where you're waiting and says, I'm so sorry, I'm running behind today. If you don't mind, I didn't wash my hands and I didn't sterilize my instruments. But it's okay because germ theory is just a theory. How quickly are you out of there? Science has the same degree of confidence in evolution theory. There's a famous quote that says that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And that's absolutely true. Evolution theory informs so much of what we do in modern medicine, modern research, modern drugs, modern cures, and the ways we look at cancer, specifically treatment. Evolution theory informs what we do in modern agriculture, genetics. We couldn't do any of these things without the foundation of evolution theory. Okay. Well, oh, there it is. Just had to push it a little harder. Here is another one of my favorite misconceptions. Evolution is not true because we've never found a missing link. And actually, this one is true. We have never found a missing link. We don't have a missing link. We actually have multiple thousands of what biologists call transitionals. We don't use the term missing link. A transitional is a word that we use to describe a species that has both modern and primitive traits. And even though fossilization is actually rare when you compare it to everything that's ever lived on Earth, we have a wealth of transitionals. For example, we have very strong evidence for the transition from fish to a four-limbed land creature. We have strong evidence for the transition from theropod dinosaurs like T-Rex to modern birds. And we also have very strong evidence for the transition from four-legged land wolf-sized creatures to the modern whales and dolphins. And this is just a drop in the bucket of the evidence that we have for transitional species. But understand that transitionals are only transitionals from our perspective, looking back in time. At the time these creatures lived, they were just who they were. They were the man of the hour, and they were adapted to the environment in which they lived. Only from our perspective, looking back through the fossil record, can we see that transitionals are giving us a snapshot of the evolutionary trajectory of some of these species. When I talk about evolution to people of faith, I'm often asked, can't we just agree to disagree? You know, I believe God did it, and I really don't care how he did it, and so let's just not talk about it. Let's just really just drop the subject. You know, I don't want to talk about it. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the cost of just agreeing to disagree, the cost of rejecting evolution as a tenet of faith. There are things that I believe, and there are things that I accept. Actually, the most important things in my life are the things I believe. I believe my family loves me. I believe I have good, rational reasons for believing that. I believe in God. But these beliefs are not subject to the scientific method. I don't believe science. I accept science evidence because, after all, a fact is true whether I believe it or not. I can believe that the earth is flat, and that doesn't change the fact that the earth is a sphere. So there are things that I believe that aren't subject to the scientific method. And there are things that I accept, evidence that I accept. How am I to be credible regarding things that require belief, regarding my faith, things that require belief? How am I to be credible in those things like the resurrection, the incarnation, miracles? How am I to be credible in those things if I deny observable, demonstrable, empirical evidence of science? Here's another cost to consider. The Barna Group tracks trends in churches, and they have for decades. One group in particular that the Barna Group tracks are the de-churched, people who were once part of a church, but no longer. And of course, the reasons why people de-churched are many and nuanced. But Barna has identified the top 6 reasons why people de-church. And consistent among the top 6 is the church is antagonistic towards science. So what this tells us is that when it comes to a forced choice between science and faith, people are not choosing faith if we force the choice. All right, up here on the screen, you see a pair of jeans. These jeans are they're caked with mud, and they're stained with oil, and they're worn out. But these are not the jeans of a hardworking man. Just a few years ago, for a mere $425, you could purchase this brand new pair of jeans from Nordstrom's department store. Already caked with mud, already stained with oil, and pre-torn. You could buy a pair of brand new jeans that appear to have a history that they, in fact, do not have. There is another steep cost to science denial. Creationism requires God to have created a world that is not as it appears. And just like those pricey jeans, Creationism demands that God created a universe with a history that it appears to have, but in fact does not. So, for example, human DNA is littered with broken genes. And these genes are broken in the same way as broken genes found in close evolutionary kin. So we have to ask ourselves, why would God insert broken genes into our genome? Why would God create creatures that look exactly as you would expect them to look if they evolved, like they shared common ancestry? Why would God create in a way that so exactly mimics evolution? Why would God create creatures and a planet that appear to have a history that they, in fact, do not have? My husband says that he remembers a book at his grandmother's house. And the book was all about fossils and dinosaurs, and it was great. But he said he remembers that the theme of the book was, these are all fake. Dinosaurs are fake. Fossils are fake. It's just, God put those all in the ground and the rocks for, whatever reason. You don't really hear that much anymore, but how different is that from saying that God purposefully put broken genes in our DNA that make it look for all the world like we share common ancestry with all life? So we have to ask ourselves, is deception consistent with the nature of God? Scriptures tell us that the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And day after day they pour forth speech, and night after night they reveal knowledge. Is this speech and knowledge truth? Or is the speech and knowledge poured forth by creation, by day and by night, something that appears to be so, but is in reality not? If there truly is evidence that the earth is young, you would think that there would be at least a few non-religious proponents for that position. You would think that if there truly was evidence for design or special creation, there would be at least a few non-religious people promoting these ideas. There are absolutely people of faith who accept science evidence for evolution in the age of the earth. But what you never find is the other way around. You never find the other way around. When Galileo got in trouble with the church for saying that the earth was not the center of everything, Galileo did not hurt the church's science feelings. Galileo hurt their theological feelings. Because, as the church reasoned, if the earth is not the center of everything, then man is no longer the center of everything, and man is no longer the apple of God's eye, and if this is not so, well, then all of Christianity falls apart. So the church's argument against the sun-centered solar system was not scientific, it was theological. There is a reason we don't find non-religious young earth creationists. The science doesn't demand it. It's the theology that demands it. It's colored by what we think about inerrancy, about what we think about original sin or the fall or even God's sovereignty. And so, this is the point where I have to take a minute, and I'm going to preach for just 1 minute here. We run a risk when we imply that our faith depends on a literal atom. If the foundation of Christianity isn't Christ, but a literal atom, we've got a big problem. Scripture tells us that there is no other name, and that name is not Adam, in Christ alone. So, sermon over. Here's your take-homes. It's easy to think that in order to have value as a human, as God's image bearer, we have to have been miraculously and instantaneously created. We had to have been made from the dust of the ground and formed like little Play-Doh men and women in our human form, as if anything less than a miraculous, sudden creation is demeaning, as if a natural process is demeaning. When a child enters a family by either a birth or adoption, we praise God for the gift of that child. But we completely understand that that child comes into the family through a completely natural, 9-month, biological, embryological process that brought that child to life. We understand that the child was brought to us by a natural process, and yet no one finds the birth of that child demeaning. We thank God for the gift, and we may even call it a miracle. The natural process does not demean the gift or the miracle or the child. Here's another cost to science denial that has a very real consequence, that's come home to me, especially over the last 2 years. We are living in the fallout and the terrible consequences of science distrust and outright science denial by too many Christians during the last 2 years in dealing with our COVID pandemic. We are living with the fallout of decades of telling Christians science can't be trusted and scientists cannot be trusted. You know, a few hundred years ago, it would have been unthinkable to be, at least publicly, an unbeliever in God. If you wanted to be king or a theologian or even be respected in your village, you had to be a God believer. But today, that's not so. We have a generation growing up in a world where being a non-believer is a very real and viable option. And this scares a lot of people, understandably. There was a large study funded by a Templeton grant a few years ago that looked at specifically science and youth ministry. But this particular study has implications for all of us. The implications to me were just astounding. What the study found that contrary to ignoring science and just not answering these students' questions when they came up in youth activities, contrary to ignoring science, the study found that if youth ministry workers included discussions of science in church, it actually stimulated discussions of God. It was amazing. It was like, okay, the earth is old and evolution is a fact. All right, so now let's talk about what it means to be people of God in a modern scientific world. Instead of dismissing God, acceptance of science brought God in to the discussions. So I have to ask, in our churches and in our families, what discussions are we missing when we are proof texting creationism? What are we missing? What important discussions are we missing with our teens, with our neighbors, with our families? What important discussions are we missing because we're still trying to put those baby dinosaurs on the ark? We're trying to make it all fit somehow. So in the process of trying to force modern science into Genesis, we often come to awkward, ill-fitting conclusions that don't do justice to the science, and they also don't do justice to the beauty and the complexity of the creation accounts that we find in the Bible. To expect Genesis to be true in the same way we expect a 21st century document to be true is misusing Scripture. Scripture can be truth without being true and literal as we define it in the 21st century by our 21st century parameters. And we miss something beautiful about the message by forcing these awkward explanations into Scripture. So, that's what I have. And do we have time for questions? Okay, well, there we go. There's the end. So hopefully, you guys have some questions for me.
We're available. Anybody want a question?
Come on.
She didn't explain everything. There are questions. Okay.
I'm interested in your connection to the people at BioLogos.
Uh-huh. I'm sorry,
I'm interested in your connection to the people at BioLogos.
the connections between me and people at BioLogos.
Yeah, I was impressed with the forward.
Forward by Deb Prasma.
And
right, yeah.
Dennis.
The publisher asked her to do that. I think they're located, not far, but definitely have been influenced by some of the writers at BioLogos, and the work that they've done has just been amazing. Francis Collins is a personal hero of mine.
What else? You're thinking you're going to read the book, so you don't have to know yet. Yeah. All right.
In what ways do you think faith challenges science?
Faith challenges science?
Yeah, in what ways do you think maybe some of the questions that faith could ask could challenge science? Like science doesn't pretend to know everything.
Right, and that's actually a good point, because I'm asked a lot in different ways. Do you find it either an awkward position to be a science educator and a person of faith? Does that ever, bring up anything, awkward among people that aren't people of faith? And my answer to that is generally no. I think even among non-believers, there is an understanding that science and faith are addressing different questions, that science is answering questions of the how and the when, and faith is answering questions of the who and the why. And science can never answer the questions of who and why. And if anyone says that they are answering them using science, they're not, because science isn't prepared to ask those kinds of questions. So I don't know that there would be a challenge to science, because you can only challenge something if it's in a field that you're expected to address. Somebody back here?
I know in some of the debates that I have seen between creationists and evolutionists, a lot of individuals kind of just, they find it difficult to comprehend that complexity could develop without being specifically designed. So you talked about DNA and so on. That DNA could develop complexity without a specific design. How do you respond to just the idea that that sounds impossible or unrealistic?
But, and that is a problem, because there is a line of creationism. It's usually described as intelligent design, which is a way of describing a creationist process that says that life is too complex to have evolved by a natural process, that everything had to have been in place all at once in complex things like the eye or the blood clotting cascade or the immune system. And so, there's that question of it had to have been designed. There had to have been like a micromanaging designer, which is always understood to be God, to put all the parts and pieces in. Well, the problem with that is that some of these systems that have been said to have been so complex that they had to have been in place all at once, we've discovered precursor steps and precursor structures in related species or in more primitive species. And so we've filled in those gaps of our knowledge, and we can explain, well, this is how the immune system evolved, or this does demonstrate that the blood clotting cascade can function without all the parts and pieces at once. And, the eye was once said to be irreducibly complex, that it had to have been there all at once. But, there are lots of creatures with eyes. They may not be as complex as ours, but for that creature, it gives them an advantage. If you can see light and dark, you're at advantage over the creature that can't see light and dark. And so it's just not an all or nothing thing. And the problem with faith is that when we try to put God into the gaps of our knowledge, what happens when we find out new information? Do we kick God to the curb? What's happened to our view of God? Even Newton himself, the great Isaac Newton, could not explain how the planets moved. And his explanation was angels. Angels are kind of pushing him around the solar system. He didn't have an explanation, so he stuck God in the gaps there. And, now we understand how planets move through the solar system. And so, what's happened to God if we chalk that up to God? So that's the primary problem, as I see it, is saying that if something is not explainable, the answer has to be God.
I'd be interested in your experience with, as a public speaker and presenting your information, with, and I don't mean this pejoratively, like conversion rate, in the sense that, it's many times it's proven you can give all the facts you want and you're not going to change anybody's mind sometimes. I'd like to know your opinions or your thoughts on that and how you've had to deal with it.
Oh, you want to get some stats for me on that? I don't, it's interesting because a lot of the feedback that I've gotten from the book specifically is from people of faith who have always had this, kind of like I did. They grew up with these questions and they didn't really have the vocabulary to express these questions. And so that was the motivation for my book. I'm an educator at heart, and I know that people can't ask questions if they don't have at least a bit of a starting ground, vocabulary to start. And so a lot of the feedback I've gotten is from people who've already kind of put a little foot in the water toward the journey. Any negative feedback that I've gotten, in book reviews, which I try not to obsessively look at, honestly, I don't think they've read the book. Because they will say things that are said in the book that were never said in the book. So I think that any major pushback that I would get, I don't know that I've really engaged these people yet, because I don't know. But so I've had a lot of positive feedback for people that have said, yes, that's what I'm thinking. And I think it gives people permission as such to retain their identity as a person of faith and still accept the science. Back here, yeah.
Well, you described me early on as the person who said, I don't care, I believe in God, and he took care of it some way, plus which I loved math, and he said with God, one day was as 10,000 years, and 10,000 years is like a day or something. Now, I added it up, and it sounded like 6 or 7 million or 10 million. It's 60 or 70 million. I got enough million to make room for dinosaurs in my head. I didn't have any problem with that, but I didn't want to go investigate it.
Yeah.
I'm 71, so I heard a lot of that. I grew up very similar to you, you know, except we did skip Sunday night one time so we could watch The Wizard of Oz.
Oh, yeah. Right. And you never saw The Wonderful World of Disney unless you were sick.
True that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I completely understand that, because if even non-religious people think evolution equals atheism, it's going to be a topic that, you know, why would we discuss something that's so anti-God? And I think that it throws a barrier up there to people. But at the same time, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, about being brought in on a conversation with a graduate student through a church I was going to at the time. He was doing an English as a second language program, and through the church. And he and his wife, well, the wife was really interested in Christianity, but the husband was a graduate student, PhD student at University of Dallas, University of Texas at Dallas in sciences. And he was just like, not so quick there. And so I was brought in, you know, to try to bridge this gap. And so, you know, my husband and I were there, we were kind of all prepared for that. And I mean, he just cut to the chase. There was no small talk. He was like, why don't Christians believe in science? Just right there. And I was like, well, actually. And so, you know, we kind of explained that that was not a tenet of Christian faith, and that there were lots of people of faith who accepted science. And we named some of the scientists he would have heard of and said, you know, it's not a requirement to be a Christian. And his whole body language just changed. His whole demeanor just changed. It's like he literally was, you could see the barrier falling down. And then after that, he never asked another science question. He wanted to know about Jesus. So why is Jesus the best approach to God? You know, tell me about, you know, what a person has to do to fight. All his questions were about Jesus. But the science was the wall between him and his questions about Jesus. And so that's one reason I feel so passionate about this, is that about that, let's just agree to disagree, because it is a barrier. And if people are told it's a forced choice, they're not picking their faith.
I know in the beginning of the book, you talk a little bit about feedback you got from students.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm assuming that played a part in you maybe writing this book or thinking about it. But I'm just wondering if you can talk about kind of what spurred you to write this, and kind of the process of writing this book. And then also if you're considering writing another book in the future. Another book in the future?
Another book in the future?
Yes.
I've got one right here. I'm talking. Yes. So your question was about the students that gave pushback? What started you writing this book? Okay. Well, I had written a blog for several years about issues in science and faith, and some contemporary issues of this intersection between science and faith. And my husband just kept saying, you need to write a book, you need to write a book, you need to write a book. And we were eating Chinese food one day, and the fortune cookie said, you love words, you should write a book. And so he's like, there you go. So I have that pinned to my bulletin board in my office. And so I just started, you know, trying to take some of those ideas that I had written in the blog, and I had done some speaking at some churches and some Bible classes and things like that. And so, you know, I knew that there was a need for more information about that. But I also knew that When I was on my own journey, I started my journey with a degree in biology and then graduate work in biology. And some of the best books that I would still recommend to read about science and faith were hard. It was hard to dive into them without a good, fairly strong background in biology. And some of them I'm even like trying to remind myself of some things. And I remember thinking that, that would deter me if I didn't know any more. And so my motivation for writing the book was to make a user-friendly book, because I teach a lot of non-majors in my biology classes, and I really do love my non-majors classes because they may not be our bench scientists, but they're going to be our teachers and our pastors and our voters and our school board members, and they need to understand science, and they need to hear about this evolution thing that they may have only heard about in church. They may have not ever heard about it anywhere else. And so my motivation was to make that book that could be a first step, to give someone a vocabulary that they could explore more and ask more questions. And I do have a book that's living in my brain right now. So anybody has suggestions for me, tell me. But I really have been perplexed by the response of too many Christians during this COVID pandemic. And I started, thinking that there's like this Venn diagram of people who reject evolution, reject some of the science surrounding COVID and vaccinations and things like that, and issues of climate. And I was just wondering, what's the common ground in there? And, I think there's something to that. Christians have been told since the 1920s not to trust science and not to trust scientists. And I just kind of want to look at that to see what's going on there. So if you've got any ideas on that, send them my way.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Janet. So people that I love and am close to have gone to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. And did you hear me?
I can't hear you.
The Ark Encounter in
the
Kentucky.
Ark Encounter. Yes.
Okay. It's very well done.
Mm-hmm.
It's very impressive, just like the Creation Museum in Dallas. And we drove through Kentucky a few years ago and chose not to go because you and I were already talking. But for the close family members that buy books for my children from there, to show them and to persuade that side of things, where do we start the conversation other than throwing your book at them?
Yeah, I had this discussion at lunch today. At what point, you want your children to grow up with a love for God and a love for Scripture, and you don't want to crush their faith. And more than likely, what they're hearing in church is, all of this is true. And, maybe just discussions of something can be truth without being literally factual history true the way we talk about it. And even, throw history and culture in there that when the Bible was written, the original hearers weren't interested in history the way 21st century people are interested in history. And they were more concerned with who is this God that we worship and what is our relationship to this God. And so, that's a hard one because, oh my, that ark, I've never been. I'm trying to figure out a way to go and not pay them any money to get in to see it. Yeah. And my parents went, and I'm like, Dad. But we had a good talk about it afterwards. Yeah. Interesting. It is interesting. I won't say who it was, but after my book came out, I got a letter, a beautiful letter from someone well in my past, from my childhood. And I knew that this letter was coming, And I will tell you, I obsessed over it for a couple of weeks because I adore this person, I respect this person, and I thought it was going to be, I'm so disappointed in you. You know, I thought that was the letter, but it wasn't. And part of what the letter said was that I went to the Ark encounter and it left me feeling empty. It just did not ring true. And I thought that was huge because this person didn't go expecting that, but just he knew enough that he understood that it just didn't ring true with the science that he knew.
Yeah, I'll do one last question here. Yeah, no pressure.
So you were mentioning how Isaac Newton was filling in the gaps with the gaps in knowledge with angels like moving the planets. So I was just wondering, when would it be acceptable to fill in the gaps with God?
When would the what now?
When would it be acceptable to fill in the gaps with God?
Well, good question. And I think that question kind of came from over here earlier. Does this faith ever challenge science? Is science going to be ever not answer anything? And absolutely, if you're asking a question that's a question of faith, science can never answer, is there a God? That's not a question for science. Science can't answer questions, is Jesus the best picture that we have of God? Those are questions of faith. And that doesn't mean at all that they're not important. Like I said, the most important things in my life are those things of faith and belief. And so my concern with just pure science knowledge, like we don't have the answer today in this particular field, like, modern genetics is just growing by leaps and bounds, and we know so much more since the Human Genome Project. And so we're learning new things all the time. What's going to happen if we get stumped and we don't know anything yet, and we say, well, no answer, it must have been, God must have stepped in at that point and fixed it. What happens, I hope there are still people of faith centuries to come. What happens in a century when we find that answer out? Are people going to say, those people thought God did that, ha, ha, ha. And I think we set ourselves up to ridicule if we try to, force God into those gaps of things that we can't explain. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think our challenge is to be very clear about what questions science can answer and what questions science cannot answer. Again, has been a big problem with understanding our approach to the pandemic, is a lack of understanding of how science works.
All right, thanks very much. And this is not supposed to be me talking, but I have to say, I feel really strongly that when we have an explanation for how something works, we are obligated to give God credit for that thing, right? So God gets the credit for everything, no matter whether or not it's a gap or not a gap, right? Okay, thank you very much, Janet. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you guys for coming. Thank you.